The warm afternoon sun filtered through the car windows as a young couple drove down the peaceful streets of their suburban neighborhood. They were riding high on emotions, having just left their doctor's appointment where they'd heard their unborn baby's heartbeat. The wife, 6 months pregnant, couldn't stop smiling as she gently rubbed her growing belly, while her husband kept glancing at her with pure joy in his eyes. "I still can't believe how strong the heartbeat was," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Her husband reached over to squeeze her hand, his wedding ring catching the sunlight. They'd been together since college, building their life step by step, first their careers, then their home, and now, finally, their family was growing. The day had started like any other Tuesday. They'd gotten up early, had their usual breakfast together, and headed to the hospital for their scheduled prenatal checkup. Everything had gone perfectly. Their baby was healthy, developing right on schedule, and they'd even gotten some new ultrasound pictures to share with their families. The wife, who worked as a high school teacher, was already planning her maternity leave. Her husband, a software engineer at a local tech company, had been researching the best baby car seats and cribs during his lunch breaks. They were the kind of couple that did everything right, paid their taxes on time, volunteered at the local food bank on weekends, and were always ready to help a neighbor in need. As they drove home, they chatted about the nursery they were planning to set up that weekend. They'd picked a gentle yellow color for the walls, wanting to keep things neutral and warm. The wife had already started collecting children's books, remembering her own mother reading to her when she was little. Her husband had surprised her last week with a beautiful wooden rocking chair he'd found at an antique store. "We should call your mom when we get home," the husband suggested, carefully signaling before making a turn. "She's been asking for updates every day." His wife laughed, knowing how excited both their families were about their first grandchild. Their parents had been friends even before they started dating, making their union feel like it was meant to be. The afternoon traffic was light, and they were making good time. The wife was already thinking about the fresh vegetables she'd bought yesterday. She was planning to make her grandmother's special soup recipe for dinner. Her husband had always loved that soup, and since becoming pregnant, she'd been craving it more and more. They were just a few blocks from home when she noticed something in the rearview mirror. "Honey," she said, her voice suddenly tense. "There's a police car behind us." Her husband checked his mirrors, maintaining his steady speed. He wasn't worried. He always followed traffic rules meticulously, and they had nothing to hide. The police cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life, its red and blue glow reflecting off their car's mirrors. The husband calmly signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, just as they'd both been taught to do. They were on a quiet street lined with maple trees, their leaves just starting to show hints of fall colors. "It's okay," the husband said reassuringly, already reaching for his wallet to get his license. "They probably just want to check something routine." His wife nodded, but her hand instinctively moved to protect her belly, a mother's natural instinct to shield her child, even before birth. Neither of them could have known that this routine traffic stop was about to change their lives forever. As they waited for the officers to approach their car, the last rays of the peaceful afternoon sun streamed through the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. In those final moments of normalcy, they were still just an expecting couple heading home from a perfect doctor's appointment, their hearts full of dreams about their future family. Little did they know that in the next few minutes, their story would become one that would shake their community to its core and force people to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, prejudice, and the power of standing up for what's right. The police cruiser's lights painted the peaceful suburban street in alternating flashes of red and blue. The husband kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, just as his father had taught him years ago. Through the rearview mirror, he could see 2 officers emerging from their vehicle, their movements deliberate and strangely tense for what should have been a routine stop. "Stay calm," he whispered to his wife, though his own heart was beginning to race. She nodded, taking slow, deep breaths, something she'd learned in her prenatal classes to keep her blood pressure steady. The baby gave a little kick, as if sensing her mother's growing anxiety. The approaching footsteps seemed unusually heavy on the pavement. From their side mirrors, they could see 1 officer approaching on each side of their car. Standard procedure, but something felt off about their demeanor. The husband's palms were starting to sweat against the steering wheel, though he'd done nothing wrong. "Driver's license and registration," the first officer demanded before even reaching the window completely. His tone was harsh, lacking the professional courtesy they'd expected. The husband kept his movements slow and clear, narrating his actions just as he'd been advised. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. The officer didn't acknowledge his words, just watched with an unsettling intensity. In the passenger seat, his wife kept her hands folded in her lap, clearly visible. As he handed over his documents, the second officer was shining his flashlight through the passenger window, despite it being broad daylight. The bright beam swept across the wife's pregnant belly, then up to her face, making her squint. She resisted the urge to shield her eyes, knowing any sudden movement might be misinterpreted. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" the husband asked politely, his voice maintaining its composure. The first officer ignored the question, instead scrutinizing the license with exaggerated care. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the crackle of the police radio and the distant sound of birds in the maple trees. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer suddenly commanded. The husband's heart skipped a beat, but his voice remained steady. "May I ask why, sir?" "We're just heading home from a doctor's appointment." He gestured gently toward his pregnant wife, hoping to appeal to the officer's humanity. The second officer's voice cut through the air like ice. He said, "Step out of the vehicle. Both of you." The wife's hand instinctively moved to protect her belly again, her wedding ring catching the late afternoon sun. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm 6 months pregnant, and we've done nothing wrong. Could you please just tell us what this is about?" Neither officer responded to her question. Instead, their hands moved to rest on their belts, a subtle but clear gesture of authority and threat. The husband felt his throat tighten, years of careful teaching running through his mind. Stay calm, be polite, make no sudden moves. What happened next would later be described in detail in numerous witness statements and official reports. But in that moment, it was simply terrifying. The first officer yanked the driver's door open with unnecessary force, while the second officer continued to shine his flashlight directly in the wife's face, despite the brightness of the day. Unknown to everyone involved, a police captain was driving by in an unmarked car. She slowed down as she noticed the scene unfolding, something about the officer's aggressive stance setting off alarm bells in her experienced mind. She pulled over quietly, a short distance away, and began to observe. The tension in the air was almost visible now, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The husband's fingers slowly released the steering wheel, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. His wife's breathing had become shallow and quick, not good for the baby, she knew, but she couldn't help it. The whole scene was frozen in a moment of terrible anticipation, like the instant before a glass falls from a table. The husband and wife exchanged a quick glance, years of love and trust passing between them in that split second. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The watching police captain reached for her phone, had years of experience telling her this situation was about to go very wrong. She needed to document everything. This wasn't going to be just another traffic stop. This was going to be something that would force their entire department to take a hard look at itself. As the sun continued its slow descent behind the maple trees, casting long shadows across the street, no one present could have predicted exactly how the next few minutes would unfold. But in that moment, on that quiet suburban street, the line between routine procedure and life-changing incident was about to be crossed. The situation began to spiral out of control in a matter of seconds. "I said get out." The first officer barked, his hand now gripping the husband's arm. The husband tried to stay calm, his voice steady even as his heart raced. "Sir, please, I'll cooperate, but my wife is pregnant. Can we please just talk about this?" From her position down the street, the police captain watched intently through her windshield, her phone recording everything. 20 years on the force had taught her to recognize when a situation was about to cross a line. She could see it in the officers' body language, in their unnecessarily aggressive stance, in the way they seemed to be looking for confrontation rather than cooperation. The wife's voice trembled as she spoke up. "We're coming from our prenatal appointment. I have the ultrasound pictures right here in my purse. Please just tell us what we did wrong." The second officer responded by yanking open her door, causing her to gasp in surprise. The baby kicked again, responding to her surge of adrenaline. "Nobody told you to speak," the second officer snapped. "Out of the vehicle. Now." The husband felt his chest tighten with fear, not for himself, but for his wife and unborn child. Everything they'd built together, their future, their dreams, seemed to hang by a thread in this moment. The police captain had seen enough. She reached for her radio, but then hesitated. No, she needed to handle this personally. She'd seen too many incidents like this swept under the rug with a quick radio call. This needed to stop here and now. "Sir, my wife needs to move slowly," the husband pleaded, his voice strained but still respectful. "She's carrying our baby. Please just give her a moment." The first officer's grip on his arm tightened. "You don't give the orders here," he growled, pulling the husband toward the back of the car. The wife struggled to get out of the car safely, her pregnant belly making it difficult to move quickly. "Please," she begged, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I'm trying to comply, but I need to be careful with the baby." The second officer showed no patience, no humanity in that moment. Neighbors were beginning to notice. Curtains twitched in nearby windows. A man walking his dog stopped and pulled out his phone. An elderly woman stepped onto her porch, her hand covering her mouth in shock. This quiet suburban street was becoming the stage for something none of them had ever expected to witness. The husband kept his eyes on his wife, trying to communicate strength and reassurance even as he was being roughly handled. They'd been through so much together: college, their first jobs, buying their home. Now, in what should have been one of the happiest times of their lives, they were facing this nightmare. The police captain stepped out of her car, straightening her blazer. She wasn't in uniform, but she carried herself with the authority of her rank. She began walking toward the scene, her phone still recording, her free hand reaching for her badge. She'd seen enough racial profiling in her career to recognize it instantly, and she wasn't about to let it continue. "They won't even tell us why they stopped us," the wife called out to the growing crowd of onlookers, her voice breaking. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if protesting the injustice of the situation. She placed both hands protectively over her belly, tears now flowing freely down her face. The first officer spun the husband around, pressing him against the car. "Stop resisting," he commanded, though the husband had been completely compliant. The second officer moved toward the wife, his stance aggressive, ignoring her obvious pregnancy and distress. Time seemed to slow down. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scene. A child's bicycle bell rang in the distance, a jarringly innocent sound in the midst of this tense situation. The police captain quickened her pace, knowing she had only moments to prevent this from becoming a tragedy. The husband could see his wife's reflection in the car window, could see the fear in her eyes, the protective way she cradled their unborn child. All their hopes and dreams, the nursery they were planning to paint, the books they'd bought, the tiny clothes waiting in gift bags at home, seemed to hang in the balance. The watching neighbors had grown silent, their phones raised like silent witnesses to the unfolding scene. The elderly woman on her porch had tears in her eyes, her hands still covering her mouth. The man with the dog had moved closer, his face a mask of concern and disbelief. Just as the second officer reached for the wife's arm, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Stop right there." The police captain's voice carried the weight of years of command. She held up her badge, her phone still recording in her other hand. Everything was about to change. The police captain's voice thundered across the suburban street, freezing everyone in place. Her badge glinted in the late afternoon sun as she strode forward with purpose. "I'm captain of the 12th Precinct," she announced, her voice carrying both authority and controlled anger. "And I'm ordering both of you officers to stand down immediately." The first officer's grip on the husband loosened slightly, confusion crossing his face. The second officer stepped back from the pregnant wife, his hand dropping from where it had been reaching for her arm. The wife let out a shaky breath, both hands still protectively cradling her belly. "Ma'am," the first officer started, trying to regain control of the situation, "this is a routine traffic stop." The captain cut him off with a sharp gesture. "There's nothing routine about what I've been watching for the past 5 minutes. Both of you step away from these citizens right now." The growing crowd of neighbors watched in tense silence as the scene unfolded. Someone whispered, "Thank God," as the officers reluctantly backed away from the couple. The husband immediately turned toward his wife, his face etched with concern. "Are you okay? Is the baby okay?" The police captain positioned herself between the couple and the officers, her phone still recording. "I want both your badge numbers," she demanded, her voice stern. "And I want to know exactly what probable cause you had for this stop." The officers exchanged glances, their earlier aggression deflating under her authoritative presence. The wife was trembling now, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. A kind-faced woman from the crowd stepped forward, offering her a bottle of water. "I'm a nurse," she said softly. "Let's get you sitting down, honey. Think about the baby." The husband kept his arm protectively around his wife as the nurse guided her to a nearby garden wall. "We received a report of a vehicle matching this description," the first officer attempted to explain, but the captain's expression showed she wasn't buying it. "Really?" she challenged. "Because I've been behind them for the past 10 minutes, watching them drive completely normally. Show me the report." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, unable to produce any documentation. The captain's eyes narrowed. "That's what I thought." She turned to the couple, her voice softening. "Ma'am, do you need medical attention? I can call an ambulance right now." The wife took a shaky sip of water, her other hand still hadn't left her belly. I think I need to see my doctor," she whispered. "The baby's moving a lot, and my heart's racing." The nurse who'd helped her nodded in agreement, her hand gentle on the wife's shoulder. The husband stood close to his wife, still processing what had just happened. Their afternoon had transformed from a happy doctor's visit to this nightmare in mere minutes. He looked at the police captain with grateful eyes. "If you hadn't come along." "But I did," the captain said firmly, before turning back to the officers. "Both of you, you're going to stay right here until backup arrives. I'm calling this in myself." She pulled out her radio, her voice crisp and professional as she reported the incident and requested both internal affairs and medical assistance. More neighbors had gathered, their phones documenting everything. The elderly woman from the porch had brought over a cushion for the wife to sit on. A young man who lived next door went to the couple's car and retrieved the wife's purse with her prenatal documents. The community was rallying around them, showing what humanity really meant. The husband held his wife's hand tightly as they waited for the ambulance. "Remember how the doctor said stress isn't good for the baby?" he murmured softly to her. "Try to take deep breaths, just like in your pregnancy classes." She nodded, trying to focus on her breathing while tears rolled down her cheeks. The police captain continued documenting everything, her phone capturing the officer's uncomfortable shifting, the support of neighbors, the way the husband tenderly cared for his wife. She'd seen too many incidents like this swept under the rug, but not this time. This time, there would be consequences. Sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer. The afternoon sun had begun to dip lower, casting long shadows across the scene. The nurse checked the wife's pulse again, offering quiet words of reassurance. The husband hadn't let go of her hand, as if afraid she might disappear if he did. "This ends today," the police captain declared, her voice carrying to everyone present. "What happened here isn't just wrong, it's against everything that badge is supposed to represent." She looked at the gathered crowd, at their phones still recording, at their faces showing a mix of concern and determination. "And we all just witnessed it." The wife suddenly gasped, pressing both hands to her belly. "The baby's kicking so much," she said, her voice trembling. The nurse leaned in closer, concern crossing her face. "The ambulance is almost here, sweetie. We're going to make sure both you and your little one are okay." The husband's face tightened with worry, but he kept his voice calm for his wife's sake. As the sound of sirens grew louder, the police captain stood firm, her presence a shield between the couple and the officers who had turned a routine traffic stop into a traumatic event. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. This was about change, about accountability, about making sure nothing like this would happen to another innocent family. The ambulance arrived with its lights flashing but sirens now silent, casting red and white pulses across the concerned faces of the gathered crowd. 2 paramedics quickly emerged, their movements efficient and professional as they made their way to the pregnant wife. The husband hadn't left her side, his hand still firmly holding hers. "I've been timing her heart rate," the nurse from the neighborhood reported to the paramedics, her voice calm but concerned. "It's been elevated for the past 20 minutes. The first paramedic nodded gratefully for the information, while her partner began setting up monitoring equipment. The police captain continued documenting everything, her phone capturing the arrival of additional police vehicles, including internal affairs investigators. The two officers who had initiated the stop stood awkwardly to the side, their earlier aggression replaced by evident unease as their supervisors approached. "The baby's still moving a lot," the wife whispered to the paramedics, her voice tight with worry. "Is that bad?" The female paramedic gave her a reassuring smile while attaching a blood pressure cuff. "Babies often respond to their mother's stress levels," she explained gently. "We're going to check everything to make sure both of you are okay." The crowd had grown larger, but remained respectfully quiet, forming a protective circle around the scene. Someone had brought out chairs for the elderly neighbors. The young man who had retrieved the wife's purse earlier was now helping direct traffic around the emergency vehicles. In crisis, the community had come together. "Your blood pressure is higher than we'd like," the paramedic noted, exchanging glances with her partner. "We should transport you to the hospital for monitoring." The husband immediately spoke up, his voice strained but determined. "I'll follow right behind the ambulance." The police captain stepped forward. "No, you're in no condition to drive right now," she said firmly but kindly. "I'll have an officer take you to the hospital." She turned and gestured to a newly arrived female officer who nodded in understanding. "She'll stay with you the whole time." Internal affairs investigators were now taking preliminary statements from witnesses. Phones were being checked for footage, contact information collected. The elderly woman who had brought the cushion was describing everything she'd seen, her voice shaking with emotion, but her memory clear and detailed. As the paramedics helped the wife onto the stretcher, she suddenly gripped her husband's hand tighter. "Our car," she said, remembering the practical details even in this moment of stress. "All the baby things we just bought." The nurse who had helped earlier stepped forward again. "I'll make sure it gets taken care of," she promised. "Just focus on yourself and your little one right now." The husband leaned down to kiss his wife's forehead as the paramedics prepared to load the stretcher into the ambulance. "Everything's going to be okay," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll be right behind you the whole way." The wife nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, one hand still protectively cradling her belly. The police captain approached the couple one more time. "I'm going to need to get statements from both of you," she said gently, "but that can wait until everyone's been checked out at the hospital." She turned to the husband. "Those officers will be facing consequences for their actions today. I promise you that." More police vehicles had arrived, including senior department officials drawn by the gravity of the situation. The two officers who had initiated the stop were now sitting in separate patrol cars, giving their statements to internal affairs investigators. Their earlier swagger had completely vanished. The neighborhood nurse had organized a small group of neighbors to take turns watching the couple's car until it could be safely moved. Another neighbor, a local teacher, was already starting an online community support group. "They're going to need help dealing with all this," she explained to others. "We need to show them they're not alone." As the paramedics finally began to move the stretcher toward the ambulance, the wife reached out and caught the police captain's hand. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "If you hadn't been here." The captain squeezed her hand gently. "Get some rest," she replied. "Focus on your baby. I'll handle everything else." The husband followed the female officer to her patrol car, looking back constantly at the ambulance where his wife was being loaded. The events of the past hour felt surreal, like a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Yet the community's response, the nurse, the neighbors, the captain, showed that even in the darkest moments, humanity and compassion could shine through. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the suburban street that had witnessed this life-changing event. As the ambulance pulled away, its lights still flashing, the gathered crowd began to disperse slowly, many leaving their contact information with investigators, others organizing among themselves to support the couple in the days to come. The police captain watched the ambulance disappear around the corner, her jaw set with determination. This incident would not be forgotten or minimized. It would become a catalyst for real change, a moment when one community stood up and said enough was enough. The emergency room buzzed with quiet efficiency as medical staff moved swiftly to care for the pregnant wife. Her husband sat close to her bed, their fingers intertwined, while monitors beeped steadily in the background. The female officer who had driven him stood respectfully near the door, providing both protection and privacy. "The baby's heartbeat is strong and regular," the obstetrician announced, studying the monitor with experienced eyes. "That's very good news." The husband and wife both released shaky breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. Their baby was okay. It was the first piece of good news in what had felt like an endless nightmare. The nurse attending to them was gentle and understanding, adjusting the wife's pillows and checking her blood pressure regularly. "Try to take slow, deep breaths," she encouraged. "Your little one is doing fine, but we need to get your blood pressure down." The wife nodded, focusing on her breathing while her husband gently stroked her hand. Outside the hospital room, the police captain was speaking with senior department officials who had arrived after hearing about the incident. Her phone footage, combined with videos from neighbors and nearby security cameras, painted an undeniable picture of what had happened. The evidence was overwhelming. "I want them both suspended immediately," one official said firmly, referring to the officers involved. "And I want a full investigation." The captain nodded, but her expression showed this wasn't enough. "We need more than just suspensions," she insisted. "We need systemic changes. This could have ended tragically if I hadn't been there." Back in the room, the wife suddenly squeezed her husband's hand as she felt another strong kick from the baby. This time, though, instead of worry, a small smile crossed her face. "Someone's trying to tell us they're okay," she whispered. The husband smiled back, his eyes glistening with tears of relief. The community support was already in motion. The couple's phones kept lighting up with messages from neighbors offering help. The local teacher who had started the online support group was coordinating meals, transportation, and even legal assistance. Their car had been safely moved to their driveway, and someone had even picked up their cat to make sure it was fed. A gentle knock at the door announced the arrival of the hospital's patient advocate. "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience," she said kindly. "We have counselors available whenever you're ready to talk." The wife nodded gratefully, while her husband squeezed her hand. They both knew they would need help processing what had happened. The female officer who had driven the husband stepped forward. "The captain asked me to let you know that both officers have been suspended," she reported quietly. "And the department is launching a full investigation." The husband nodded, but his focus remained on his wife and their unborn child. Right now, their family's health was all that mattered. As evening settled in, the hospital room became a peaceful sanctuary. The harsh fluorescent lights were dimmed, and the monitoring equipment created a soft, steady rhythm. The wife's blood pressure had finally started to come down, much to everyone's relief. The baby's movements had settled into a normal pattern. Outside the room, the world was already responding to what had happened. News outlets were picking up the story. Civil rights organizations were reaching out. The police department was facing tough questions. But inside this quiet space, a family was healing, supported by their community and protected by those who had sworn to serve and protect the right way. "Do you still want to paint the nursery yellow?" the husband asked softly, trying to bring back some normalcy. His wife smiled, tears in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Our baby deserves all the bright, beautiful things we planned." It was a small moment of defiance, refusing to let this incident steal their joy or change their dreams for their child. The night shift nurse came in to check vitals again, her movements quiet and efficient. "Everything's looking much better," she reported with a warm smile. "Your little one is handling everything like a champion." The wife managed a tired smile, her hand never leaving her belly, that protective instinct now stronger than ever. Throughout the evening, messages of support continued to pour in. The neighborhood nurse who had helped earlier sent a text saying she'd organized a schedule of people to help with anything they needed in the coming weeks. The elderly woman from their street called to say she was knitting something special for the baby. The police captain stopped by one last time before ending her shift. "We're not letting this get swept under the rug," she promised. "What happened today? It's going to lead to real changes." She paused, then added more softly, "But right now, you just focus on your family. Let us handle the rest." As night settled fully over the hospital, the couple found moments of peace amid the chaos of the day. Their baby was healthy, they were safe, and they had discovered that even in the darkest moments, there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and show that humanity and compassion still existed in the world. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, the nursery was finally finished. Soft yellow walls glowed in the morning sunlight, while white curtains danced gently in the breeze. The husband stood in the doorway, watching his wife arrange stuffed animals in the crib. Her belly was much bigger now, their baby due any day. "Can you believe how much has changed?" she asked softly, running her hand over the handmade blanket the elderly neighbor had knitted for them. The community's support hadn't faded with time. If anything, it had grown stronger. Their street had become more than just a neighborhood. It had become a family. The police captain's promise of change hadn't been empty words. The 2 officers involved had been terminated from the force, and their case had sparked a department-wide review of policies and practices. New training programs were being implemented, focusing on racial sensitivity and proper treatment of pregnant women during stops. "The support group meeting is at 3 today," the husband reminded her gently. What had started as a small neighborhood initiative had grown into a powerful community organization. They now helped other families who had faced similar situations, offering everything from emotional support to legal assistance. The wife had become an important voice in these meetings, sharing their story to help others heal and fight for change. Their story had reached far beyond their small suburb. Civil rights organizations had used it to push for new legislation. Police departments in other cities were studying what happened as an example of what needed to change. The police captain had been promoted and was now leading a new division focused on community relations and officer accountability. The morning newspaper sat on their kitchen table, featuring an article about the changes their case had sparked. But more importantly to them was the small community newsletter beside it, filled with birth announcements and neighborhood news. Their baby would be born into a community that had stood up for what was right, that had shown what real unity looked like. "Remember how scared we were that day?" the wife asked, settling into the rocking chair. The same one they'd bought before everything happened. "And now look at us." Her husband knelt beside her, placing his hand on her belly. "Look at how much good has come from something so wrong," he agreed. The nurse who had helped them that day had become a close friend, stopping by regularly to check on them. The elderly neighbor still brought them home-cooked meals every Sunday. The young man who had helped with their car now mowed their lawn without being asked. Small acts of kindness that showed how a community could come together and stay together. Their doorbell rang. It was the local teacher who had started their support group, dropping off some paperwork. The group was now working with the police department to develop new guidelines for traffic stops involving pregnant women. "Your story is changing things," she told them, her eyes bright with purpose. "You're making the world a little better for every baby that comes after yours." The wife touched her belly thoughtfully. "I used to worry about bringing a baby into this world," she admitted. "But now I see how many good people there are, how many people are willing to stand up for what's right." Her husband squeezed her hand, understanding exactly what she meant. The police captain still checked on them regularly. She had become more than just the person who intervened that day. She was now a symbol of what law enforcement should be. "Your baby is going to grow up in a different world," she had told them recently. Because people saw what happened to you and said, "No more." As evening approached, neighbors began their usual walk past the house, waving and calling out gentle greetings. Some stopped to leave small gifts for the baby on their porch. Others just wanted to make sure the couple was doing okay. It had become a neighborhood tradition, this quiet show of ongoing support and love. The wife stood at their living room window, watching the sunset paint the sky in beautiful colors. "You know what's amazing?" she said to her husband. "That day could have broken us. Instead, it showed us how strong we all are together." Her husband wrapped his arms around her, careful of her belly. "It showed us what community really means," he added. Their baby chose that moment to kick, strong and healthy. The wife laughed, a sound that had returned to their home in the months since the incident. "I think someone agrees," she said, placing her husband's hand where their child was moving. This was the future they were fighting for, not just for their baby, but for all children. Later that night, as they sat on their porch swing, they could see their neighborhood in a new light. Every house represented someone who had stood up for them, who had shown that love was stronger than hate, that community was more powerful than fear. Their child would grow up knowing this story, not as a tale of trauma, but as proof that positive change was possible when people came together. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and the wife leaned against her husband's shoulder. Tomorrow would bring another support group meeting, more work on police reform, more small steps toward lasting change. But tonight, they could just be a family, waiting for their baby, surrounded by a community that had become their shield and their strength.